Today is our first day of coverage of Tom Stoppard's play, Arcadia. And I don't know how far you've read of this play so far, or what your experience of it has been. But for me, it's got to be one of one of the funniest, most intelligent, clever, but also moving plays that I've ever read. I mean, I know Waiting for Godot was another favorite, but this play is just so clever and so funny. I just hope that you'll. I mean, I know it's hard. Okay, so like because of all of the math and science and philosophy, not to mention the literature that is part of the content of this play. I've had to put a lot of work into trying to understand it well enough to teach it decently. But it has been such a satisfying experience, and I hope that if you feel like it takes work to try to put things together in here, all I can say is I think it'll be satisfying in the end. I mean, usually by the time I get to the, the last day of teaching it, I'm always afraid I'm going to start breaking down and crying, talking about it, because I think that all the pieces coming together at the end is so beautiful. Even if you've only read a few pages into this text, you can see that there's an awful lot going on. So I want to talk just briefly about some of the many things that are involved in the plot and the story to try to establish a context. And so first of all, I mean, there is a double time frame. Half of the scenes, or about half of the scenes, take place in 1809, or actually at the end, it moves to 1812, so 3 years later. But then the other half of the play takes part in the present. Now, and at the very end, in the last scene, we actually have both time frames on stage at the same time, which is really pretty clever and pretty difficult, and it kind of works very well. But we'll come back and talk more about that. Then there's also, I'm going to talk about the classical versus romantic intellectual position. And again, we'll come back to that in just a minute. Landscape architecture, this is not something that everybody's that familiar with. But it kind of goes along with some of the other tensions that are in the play. And then you've probably also noticed there's a lot of math and a lot of science, which is kind of a challenge for some of us literary types that don't always go there. And then the other thing, which is really a central role in this play, is, and it says sex, love, and desire here. But it's not so much about sex as it is about desire. And I think the word eros is really what's at play here. But that's a topic for later on. All right, so these are some of the things we'll be talking about. Let's go back and talk about each of them separately. The double time frame, I guess the thing that, if we were in class and if you were there, I would be asking you, what do you think the significance is of 1809 or 1812? Why these two time frames? What's significant about that moment? And, if you think about it in literature, this is around the time that Jane Austen is writing. But it's also around the time of the beginning of the Romantic period in English literature. Now, 1798 is usually the date that we say that the Romantic period began, but that was really the very beginning, and Coleridge and Wordsworth were really pioneers there. So there were still a lot of people who were much more inclined to be in the previous period, which in English literature was the neoclassical period. All right, so in other words, it's a transition between classical values being more popular, more trendy, and then between that and the beginnings of a more romantic time frame. So what do we mean by that? And this is another time where I'm really regretting that students don't have to take the humanities course anymore. Because all through that 2 semester course, we talk about classical values versus not so much romantic, but rejection of classical values. Classical values. If you go back to classical Greece, classical Rome, there's an emphasis on restraint and caution. Not caution so much. I don't think that's the right word. Balance, order, and proportion. These are all things that, all things in their measure, okay, not excess, but then there's usually, after these classical periods, whether it's classical Greece, classical Rome, the Renaissance was another return to classical values, then there's usually a rejection of that. Artists want excess. They want more emotion. They want feeling instead of thought, exuberance, excess, subjectivity. What's going on in my heart. I always, in the second semester of humanities, I would always make the main paper a project about the head versus the heart, which is in essence the classical versus romantic disposition. I don't know if you've ever heard of a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It used to be a very famous book, but in that book, the author and the narrator, I guess, of the book kind of sets out this idea that anybody who has a thought in their head has a tendency either to classical values or to romantic values, and that's kind of something that's really key in this play. There are characters who are much more inclined toward classical values, and other characters are much more inclined to romantic ideas. Now, some of the characters, and I think especially Thomasina and Septimus at the beginning, they have kind of traits of both, and they're not so clearly identified with just one or the other. But in the contemporary time frame, the characters are much more solidly either romantic or classical, and so we'll see more of that as we go along. So in the history of Western artistic expression, I often talk about what I call a pendulum swing back and forth between periods that adhere to classical values and then periods that follow them that kind of reject them. I already mentioned, classical Greece, but followed by Hellenistic Greek style, which is a rejection of balance and order, much more emotional. After the Roman period, you have the Middle Ages, and there's a rejection of, another characteristic trait of the classical values is the representation of the human form in art and sculpture as being very realistic. And then in periods after classical periods, often there's kind of rejection of that. So in the Middle Ages, there was not as much of attention to representing the human form well, because for them this was the early Christian period, and the human body was downplayed and covered up, and so having classical sculptures of nude bodies was not something that they would want to do. So the pendulum swing back and forth is something. So we have then after the Renaissance we have the Baroque period in art, which is much more emotional, much more passionate, and then there's a neoclassical period in Europe, and then the Romantic period. Okay, so now that's when we get to this idea of what do we mean by romantic, where it actually gets a name. So the tension between classical values and romantic values shows up all over the place in this play. It's here. The tension is here in the landscape architecture. What we have here, this shot is of one of the gardens of Capability Brown. He's someone who's mentioned in the play. And if you see, one of the things you might notice is, there's a lot of symmetry, there's a lot of balance. It's very decorative, but the building, the house in the background looks kind of classical because it has columns, which remind us of Greek temples and everything. And so that's at the beginning of the play, one of the conversations that's going on is the landscape architect of the of Sidley Park. Noakes is his name. He is making plans to tear down a lot of the more classical forms and structures to replace them what is called the picturesque style, which is much more romantic. This is a painting by Salvatore Rosa, and he is also mentioned in Act One or Scene One of the play. And he's not a landscape architect himself; he's a painter. But what his paintings often depict are, scenes of almost like medieval Gothic mood, and pictures of things that are ruins. You see this bridge is like it's kind of all falling down, and then up at the top of the hill here you see some other ruins. So his paintings kind of influenced landscape architecture, so that people actually built new ruins. I mean, think about how ironic that sounds. But the idea was that these sort of more emotional, looking back at the past, somber scenes, they wanted to recreate this. And so this is what Lady Croom is so up in arms about. Is she likes the more the classical style in landscape architecture. The classical versus romantic tension also shows up in the math and the science that are a part of this play. And some of these people that are talked about in the opening scene include Sir Isaac Newton, whose algebra, whose laws of motion. These are classical for mathematicians. We call this classical, but other things are being talked about in this play, having to do with math and science, like the second law of thermodynamics, and that's what this diagram is of. So the second law, and if you go online and type in on YouTube, for example, second law of thermodynamics, you can find lots of short videos that kind of explain what this means. And we'll talk about this as we go on a little bit later, but we don't need to do that right now. But some things like that are there. But eventually they'll start talking about chaos theory and iterated algorithms, which are things that us literary types don't often talk about. And it's really, complex. If you think about Thomasina in Act 1, scene 1, she talks about there's got to be a formula, even if it's too advanced for any human being, but it must be in God's mind that there must be a formula for all the actions that happen in the universe, and so there's a lot going on here with this. This central theme of sex, love, and desire is introduced immediately when we look at the text. And this is not just a cheap trick. I mean, there are lots of sex jokes and other kinds of jokes in this play, but it's not just a gratuitous use of a dirty joke of sorts. When Thomasina says, "Septimus, what is carnal embrace?" Carnal embrace is the practice of throwing one's arms around the side of beef. So the theme is going to be with us for the entire play, and it's not really just about having sex. There are quite a few witty exchanges in these first few pages, and usually when I'm teaching in the classroom, I try to get some students to volunteer to read for the humor, for one, but also to be introduced to these two main characters in the 1809 time frame, Thomasina and Septimus. So what we have here, first of all, is Thomasina is clearly a prodigy. She's really too intelligent for her own sake. And at the end of the scene, Septimus does say to her, "It's not polite to be cleverer than her elders," and she goes, "Am I?" So yeah, she's a very uh, amazing young girl who has this incredible intellect. But she's also a young girl, and so she's innocent but kind of wanting to know things. Septimus also clearly is a very educated person and a very witty person. So these two are mentor and student, but also they're kind of like closer to equals than anyone else. And for the most part, they get each other's jokes, and it is also important here to see that despite her innocence, and in addition to Thomasina being very, very intelligent, she also tricks Septimus in this opening scene, where she I think, knows that carnal embrace does not have to do with meat. It has to do with human beings, because when on page 6, when Thomasina says, "Oh, it was not my algebra. I heard Jellyby telling Cook that Mrs. Chater was discovered in carnal embrace in the gazebo." And Septimus says, "Really, with whom did Jellyby happen to say?" So she's kind of tricked him into giving away that his definition of carnal embrace is not really the thing. And one more thing I wanted to say about these two central characters is going back to that idea of classical values versus romantic values. I mentioned how many of the characters can be identified with one or the other. Now, with these two characters, I'm not sure if it's quite as clear, because clearly they both are rational and logical. They emphasize the use of the mind, but at the same time, like in scene 3, Thomasina, when the thing about Cleopatra is introduced, she gets into a big a passionate response about Cleopatra, because she calls her a noodle, and it's all about sex. But Thomasina is also being very passionate. So, and then Septimus, for all of his intelligence and wittiness, and you think that he's more, his disposition tends to be more towards classical values. At the same time, he's just had this sexual tryst with Mrs. Chater, and we find out later that he seems to be in love with Lady Croom, Thomasina's mother. And so, where exactly do we find their identities, their dispositions? With them, it's not that clear. But when we look at the second scene, and we look at the contemporary time frame, I think that's more clearly distinguished between the two main characters. In scene 2, we meet Hannah and Bernard, two intellectuals who have projects going on. They have an academic project. Hannah is clearly of a more classical disposition. She's really heavy on evidence. She describes romanticism at one point as, quote, the decline from thinking to feeling. And in this passage that we have here, she's talking about her project having to do with the hermit of Sidley Park. And here we have that he covered every sheet with Kabbalistic proofs that the world was coming to an end. Isn't it it's perfect, isn't it? A perfect symbol, I mean. Of what? The whole romantic sham, Bernard, right? So romanticism is a sham. It's what happened to the Enlightenment, isn't it? A century of intellectual rigor turned in on itself. A mind in chaos suspected of genius. In a setting of cheap thrills and false emotion. All right, so the Enlightenment, I should mention that too, is something that we associate with um, the neoclassical period, and a period of more classical values. Um, so she's calling it, she's privileging that over the Romantic period. So she calls the Enlightenment a century of intellectual rigor, and Romanticism is a sham. Right, Bernard, on the other hand, clearly is of a romantic disposition. His project has to do with Lord Byron, who is, really in some ways the perfect romantic hero in English literature. Someone who is passionate and was of the heart, and he went to different wars in Europe to try to fight for different causes. But his method is also more romantic. I mean, his project is based on conviction, and rather than evidence and proof, it's more about his gut instinct. I mean, he says at one point, when he's talking with Hannah about their differences, and he says, she has no guts, and his project is all based on the conviction of what he believes to be true. Now, I haven't mentioned the other character here, Valentine, who is he is of the Krum family, so distant relation to Thomasina. Um, he is also an academic, and he clearly sides with Hannah in the classical versus romantic disposition. He's very much into evidence, and he also has this thing for Hannah. He calls Hannah his fiancée. They have this kind of gag going on that they're engaged, but they're really not. So I mean, it's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, he's a third character in here who is part of the exchange between the minds of these classical versus romantically inclined academics. Between now and next time, I think it might be useful if you could turn to these two main characters in scene two, Hannah and Bernard, and try to figure out exactly what their projects are. I mean, this is kind of intellectual stuff, and it's complicated, and it has to do with not just literature, but sometimes math and science. But I think it would help, in getting what this play is about, to kind of get a clear sense of what it is each of them is doing, how each of them is approaching their topic, and in which case, like which one of them succeeds and which one gets it wrong and why. So be thinking about that between now and next time. Right, I've sent out an assignment for next time, or between now and next time at least, and it's not the usual discussion board Q&A. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if you go on the course page here and follow this link, it will take you to a website for Skidmore College's project. I don't want to take the time to explain this, but they had a project with a common reading project associated with their first year experience class, where everyone on campus, or all the freshmen, read Arcadia. And they used faculty resources from various disciplines to be involved in this. And so if you follow that link, you'll come to this page. And this is not the top of the page, so you need to scroll down a little bit to find this chart. And all of these in the boxes here in the cells are links to different short essays that different faculty members from the college wrote and contributed to this project. All right, so in the instructions that I sent out about the assignment, then I'm going to be asking you to write a brief, a 250 word or so synopsis or main ideas of of one of these particular papers that I'm going to ask you. I'll assign them to you. Okay, so I just wanted to show you how to get there if it's not immediately clear from the instructions I send out. And then I would also ask, as normally when we spend 3 days on a particular text, on the second day, I usually ask you try to have the work finished. So I would say try to get to the end if you can. There are a lot of different things to talk about in this play, and it will help, I think, to have more of a complete picture.